This is a very exciting time for all of us as scholars to really think seriously and deeply about the issues, the concerns, and questions we have about immigrant and refugee populations here in the United States as well as around the world. And I'm delighted today to be moderating this panel of distinguished scholars who are going to share their work with you today. First of all, they're going to share about 5 minutes concerning their work and any central research questions that they're probing around. And then we're going to take about 15 minutes to engage interactively around some questions that they have raised for the whole panel. And then the last 15 minutes, we're going to ask you to engage with us on questions that you have that have been raised. So I'm going to ask Mary if she would begin, and then we'll just go around the panel.
You're going to clock me? Yeah. So I think what might be most helpful, and you heard a little bit of an introduction about this project we're working on called Teachers for Teachers in Kakuma Refugee Camp, but maybe just to zoom out for a minute and kind of paint the picture of what it looks like in terms of refugee education and what we're talking about. And there's a lot of information covered in the media that may be well or not so well informed in terms of the picture that's being painted. But currently, as you might know, we have over 65 million people who are displaced around the world. And when people are displaced in this sense, and either they're internally displaced or displaced across the border into neighboring countries or elsewhere, they tend to be displaced for upwards of 20 to 25 years, right? So if we're concerned about education, we have to think about what the needs of those children and youth are when they are displaced. And while we have a number of human rights documents and declarations upholding the right to education, regardless of the situation that these young people find themselves in, what that actually looks like in practice can be quite challenging, right? So even though we have these different human rights frameworks, many children are not in school. And so within the refugee population globally, which is around 21 million, there are around 60% of that population that actually access primary education, 23% that access secondary education, and a very paltry 1% that access higher education. And that's just access, right? That's not retention, that's not completion, that's not actually what they've learned in these contexts. So in a place like Kakuma Refugee Camp, what you find, this is a camp that's been there for 25 years. They're going on the third generation being born in that camp. Most of the refugees are from South Sudan and from Somalia, but also from other neighboring countries. Many of the kids are growing up there if they're lucky enough to go to school. If they graduate from high school, they are then eligible to be teachers. The camp is in a very remote part of the country. There's some supervision by the Ministry of Education in Kenya, but by and large, the education is run by the international organizations working in the camp, like the UN Refugee Agency and various non-governmental organizations. So these very young people, mostly men, 18, 19 years old, have finished high school. There are very few opportunities to work because you're legally not allowed to work in Kenya or most other places if you're displaced as a refugee. But in a camp setting, you're able to work as what we call an incentive worker. So you're able to earn a very small salary for doing different jobs. And being a teacher is one of those options in the camp. What does that look like? So these young people get hired to be teachers. They're thrown into classrooms with upwards of 160 students from multiple nationalities, multiple languages, and these teachers typically have received no training. Right? So I have done some research in the area in Kenya around the quality of refugee education. What does education look like for kids in those camps? For those who might go to Nairobi or to some of the other cities in Kenya, what type of access to education can they have? And after doing some of that work, I got exposed a little bit more to what was happening in the camp and just was floored that these young people with, full of good intention wanted to be teachers and wanted to give back because they saw the value of what education meant for them growing up in that camp, even not knowing what their future might hold, not knowing if they can return to South Sudan or Somalia, not knowing if they can successfully integrate into Kenyan society, which is very difficult, and not knowing if they'll ever be resettled to a country like the United States or Canada. Of all the refugees, only 1% are ever resettled. So while we, have all these concerns about immigration and refugees coming into this country, the reality is it's a very small number of people who are actually successful in navigating that process and being successfully resettled here. So after seeing what was happening in these contexts and, again, well-intentioned young people wanting to give back, and finding that there was no teacher training, working with our students here, we said, okay, is there a role that a university could play in this? Is it even appropriate for us to play a role in this? But feeling a real need, because the overall funding for humanitarian aid, and particularly to education within that, is very small. It's about 2% of the total humanitarian aid budget goes to education. And we thought, what is a unique way for a university to respond? In a teacher's college, where we work with teachers and care deeply about teachers, what could we do? And so we engaged in a very participatory process with the teachers in the camp. And we initially through some research, and we asked them, what was your experience like as a student? What's your experience now as a teacher? What do you think your own teacher professional development needs are? And we took a lot of time to listen to them and to hear what they wanted to do and how we might be able to collaborate together. And so we were inspired to create this notion of Teachers for Teachers, where we have the luxury of flying in and out of the camp. These teachers are the experts of those classrooms. I might have my fancy degrees, I might have worked and taught in different schools in different places, but I will never know what it feels like to work in a classroom with 160 kids with no teacher training, with multiple languages, and no support. Right? So they were the experts in that, all of the design work and the implementation work that we've been doing. And so we have a whole teacher training, and then using them to become peer coaches to one another, engaging in teacher learning circles, and really supporting each other to say, you're not in this alone. There's a way to collaborate. There are ways to create communities of practice here in the camp, kind of horizontally, vertically, because of us being in Teachers College. And then we added this layer of mobile mentors who are mentors around the world, actually. I think we have 60 different countries represented now in the latest recruitment of mentors. And they're connecting with these teachers through WhatsApp. And they're passionate educators or trained teachers themselves, working in very different contexts, some of whom have worked in international settings or displacement settings, so they can relate in some ways. But more, again, they're not the mentors are not the experts, the teachers in the camp are the experts, and just creating these different layers of support horizontally and vertically. And trying to continue to say from the teachers, what do you need? How can we help? And what is changing in this process for you in terms of your teacher identity, in terms of your teacher motivation, in terms of your commitment to remaining teachers in this particular context. And I can tell you, as much as they kind of applaud our efforts for coming in and helping with this project, it's us that's been incredibly inspired and motivated ourselves to continue to provide this support. And so I can probably leave it there, because I'll probably get the time signal here in a second from Michelle. But just to give you a sense, just what these teachers are up against, and yet they come every day ready to work, ready to help each other. And it's just been a real privilege to be part of that. So happy to share more about that work as we continue the conversation. Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon. Stateless. So a lot of my work has really focused on undocumented immigrants and documented students here in the U.S., and then that's what I've prepared some thoughts around. And when I talk about this issue, I really talk about this about a crisis that's going on within our borders. And we often don't frame it that way, but it really is a crisis. And it's largely a crisis that we have created by our actions internationally, as well as domestically, as well as inactions that we have taken. Some domestic policy context I'll just share with you very briefly. Between 2008 and 2016, there have been 3.1 million undocumented immigrants who have been deported from our country. Shattering really sort of the lives of these families and economic stability and the educational pathways of many of the adolescents of these families. The other issue is this notion of the Trump effect, to borrow a term from the Southern Poverty Law Center, who has really said that the xenophobic policies that Trump went ahead and launched during his campaign, we have really seen the remnants of this in our society and certainly in our schools that have very much affected the undocumented immigrant population in the U.S. And larger than just that, the effect that it's had, there's some real consequences that has come with the Trump regime. Some figures I'll share with you. There's been a 37% increase in the interior deportation of undocumented immigrants in the nearly 8-month period, comparing FY16 and FY17 when Trump went ahead and overtook the White House. Perhaps most alarming, we see a 175% increase between FY16, fiscal year 16, and fiscal year 17 in the non-criminal deportation of undocumented immigrants here in the U.S. And then we certainly know in September 2017 when the Trump regime went ahead and rescinded DACA. So some research I've engaged in with my colleague, Dr. Toko Ushio from the University of Michigan, we've been looking at sort of this notion of the Trump effect in the state of Michigan. And what we've seen, I'll just share a couple of things with you around this notion that families, we've interviewed 10 families so far, have discussed this notion of an awakened and elevated discriminatory sentiments that they've seen and they have felt in their everyday lives. This suffered traumatic event that has been the election of Trump and the threatened educational pathways that has affected and afflicted adolescents in these families. So families really sort of talked about sort of feeling looked at post-election, right, and how this has affected them, right, just in their day-to-day work or in their day-to-day engaging with the public. They feel this notion of sort of being looked on. Children also experience xenophobic comments, such as, you know, when are you going to go back home? Is what families shared with us. Or like one father from Grand Rapids said, he said, quote, "And now anyone on the street can tell you, and they see it as, quote, it is okay for me to hate you because the president does." So a lot of families described November 8th, 2016 as really a traumatic event for their family. Notions of adolescents talking to their parents about saying, when are we going to leave? Or one child went ahead and packed a bag and decided to go ahead and put the suitcase underneath her bed at home. Periodically would go in there, open up the luggage, and change her clothes, given her change in size, to make sure that she would have clothes that would fit her. So this is a traumatic event that these families are experiencing. And then we certainly know the threatened educational pathways. Many parents and adolescents are talking about, right, the rescinding of DACA and what ramifications that has had. You know, this crisis is really an urgent crisis. I've been doing research in this area for well over a decade, but now it's really heightened. I mean, now it really truly has with Trump overtaking the White House. It has really been a pervasive threat on the everyday lives of these families. These families are facing microaggressions. They are facing these discriminatory policies in their everyday lives. This is something that they are getting bombarded with by the media. They're getting bombarded by this at schools, and it really is something that is affecting these families quite tremendously. I'll leave it at that. Happy to answer questions later regarding what I think is really truly a crisis.
Okay, I feel very sobered now. Thinking about those quotes it is quite a sobering time. And I sit and work in the intersection of kind of geography and citizenship, and so I want to kind of bring that into the conversation and think about what that might mean for immigrant youth in the United States, but the issues I might raise in the United States are not specific to the United States. These are questions I think that are raised across the globe. I think sometimes we talk about this as kind of an era. We kind of talk about, you know, the current era as something of kind of more mobile or something like this, and we forget about the history of mobility and how people have moved across time and space. And in many places, part of that has been that we haven't had national boundaries and borders. Those are these kind of contemporary markers that demarcate land. But people have always been in motion and moving and migrating, and so let's keep that in mind as we start talking about how we've then built barriers to kind of prevent that and stop that, and then what it means to build a nation. What does it mean to build a nation state? What is the kind of the colonial legacy of the nation, and what it's designed to do in terms of ethnicity, and where does that resonate then today in these conversations about the attempts to clamp down on pluralistic democracies, pluralistic nation states, the idea that there might be a multiplicity of nations within a state, for example. So these are all things that we're wrestling with across the globe. This is not specific to the United States, and I think it's very worth thinking about. We talk about undocumented youth, we talk about refugee youth, we think about the displacement of people. There are a lot of people who live either because of refugee status in displaced places, but just even within states where you think people are not displaced, don't have citizenship. And so I think about the different pathways to citizenship, right? There's the ideas about kind of the formal legacies of citizenship, those markers that are kind of having legal standing. But even as immigrant youth think about the legal standing, perhaps there's the questions of what does it mean to be a citizen, and do I want those legal standings, or what am I really gaining by this movement, by this migration, by having this legal standing versus where do I belong? And that's where kind of I want to step in with the work that I do. And thinking about, we often talk about immigrant youth here, and we talk a lot about language, and I know we'll hear about it next. But I also want to think about the issues that youth face in school, immigrant youth, that are not specific to language, that youth bring into the schools, immigrant youth bring into the schools, that really do deal with these issues ultimately around citizenship, and whether students will belong, whether students will become citizens, what it would mean to be a citizen, and what one then does with that citizenship. And my work specifically in New York City is with African youth. So African youth who are newcomer youth, meaning they've moved to the United States in the 7th grade or later, and they're wrestling with these ideas in school. So what does it mean to be an African youth in school? I think the issues that I want to raise and put into the conversation, there's a lot of research around immigrant youth in the United States, but not a lot about Black youth, about African youth specifically, and the issues around kind of race, religion, gender, and kind of the integration and the coloniality of Africa that then manifest themselves in those youth experiences. And so, the United States is a racialized country. We're built on racial inequality and racial oppression in this country. And so African youth coming to this country step into a space that they're not accustomed to being built on, in that way within their homeland, being built off of racial oppression. And so what does it mean to step into this as a Black student and meander into the spaces of where do I belong? With whom do I belong? What does it mean to become a U.S. citizen if a U.S. citizen is based on a white ideology? So these are some of the things that, so there's an important racial component. There's the flipping of class, that many of the immigrant youth we work with, class status in their African homes were middle class, upper income. Moved to the United States, particularly in New York City, and suddenly find their entire family living in a 2-bedroom apartment as opposed to a 10-room house. And that shift in class status, their families wrestling to find income, make the means to support themselves here in New York City, but also to have the means to continue to contribute to this global economy and movement of finances back and forth. And so families who think they might be able to visit relatives find themselves unable to move back and forth and visit relatives in the way that other kind of closer immigrant groups might be able to do because of the longevity both of getting back and forth to Africa, a much more expensive trip, but also the ongoing risk around U.S. immigration standards about getting the visa to return to the United States. We can talk, some of those things that you talked about. One of the consequences of the undocumented legislation was that African countries who refused to take back their forced deportations were granted no more visas back and forth. So if a family had left thinking they were returning to the United States and they were Senegalese, they were suddenly forbidden in November for returning to the United States, even though they had a visa to return. But we stopped recognizing the visas of Senegalese and Guinean citizens. So these are some of the kind of day-to-day realities that kind of young people are wrestling with. And I think the last thing I want to bring up, and I did a really exciting project 2 years ago with African immigrant youth, doing photo stories of their experiences in New York City. And I think one of the things that the photo stories allowed them to really exhibit was the way in which Africa, the kind of this construction that they hadn't really had until they moved to the United States, became something that was really manifest in their day-to-day mobility in the city. Something they constantly had to wrestle with. Kind of either the tale of being African and what it meant to be African, and the ideas about what people then presume to know about them, and the ways in which they are kind of labeled under this very pessimistic and stereotypical kind of discourse about who they are and what their potential is. But furthermore, then, the ways in which they showed their agency around it, which was to connect to which was to connect to one another and to connect to the kind of the networks that are here, and to really expose and bring those networks to life and to take advantage of those networks that are allowed to remain here, but also to recognize that those networks are at risk. If those networks don't fit in with U.S. customs and U.S. cultures, then what is built into those networks is at risk for being exposed and being brought in front of social services and leading to deportation. So the constant move back and forth of kind of wanting to recognize the networks, but the threat upon those networks based upon, not the U.S. kind of not finding proper certain kind of cultural norms within those social networks. So the kind of these constant inabilities that are affecting, so a young person comes to school, but there's this constancy of the legacies that they're bringing into this classroom that are part of that immigrant experience. And so those are the things that I'm interested in, happy to answer and talk more about. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My work is in the field of speech-language pathology. That means that I work and train professionals who will help individuals who have communication disorders, and they include speech problems such as mispronunciation of particular sounds or stuttering, or language issues from not being able to be good to understand language very well, or we also treat people who have language disorders due to another disability, such as autism or intellectual disability. And my area of expertise is, I study the characteristics and the assessment and the intervention for young children who are dual language learners and who also have a communication disorder. I think typically when we think about bilingual issues, we forget about the children who have special needs. And there are many children who are bilingual, children of immigrants, grandchildren of immigrants, or immigrants themselves who have disabilities. And the field of special education took a little bit longer time to deal with those linguistic issues. So when I started to be in this field, there was a large need to create adequate assessment tools, because many children were only assessed in English, and of course they were starting to learn English, so they appeared to be very severely affected. And we caught some children who actually did not have special needs, but were misdiagnosed as having disabilities. And when I started, that was the main issue, being able to characterize a true language disorder from a language difference, because we were afraid of misdiagnosing these children. I think that in the last years, it has changed. There is a little bit more awareness of that, but now we have diagnosis, particularly for the young children. So people know that maybe they speak another language at home. They're exposed to another language, so they think, we do have federal laws protecting the misdiagnosis. So clinicians, educators err to the other side, and they don't want to identify the children. And what happens? We lose very valuable years, and they get further behind. So my research has focused on that, on really developing adequate tools, good language testing, in particular in my case in Spanish, but understanding the principles so they can be used for other languages, not just Spanish, and being able to identify these children adequately. I also worked in intervention because, once again, I think many people support the idea that bilingualism is a good thing, that it's a positive aspect of an education. However, rarely we see bilingual special education programs. And so I worked to develop an intervention for preschoolers, Spanish-English preschoolers with language disorders that actually aims to use the strengths they have in their home language and then to facilitate English learning. And we have seen very positive results. So that's my research interest. I also train future speech-language pathologists. So I need to tell you a little bit about my profession. We are both a health profession and education profession, and it is, unfortunately, it really is not a diverse profession. I think that only the last statistic was 7% of the membership of the Association of Speech Pathologists is non-white as a whole. So we really need to increase the number of future speech pathologists coming from diverse backgrounds, because they are actually the ones who come with the strength to and the understanding of their community, of the cultures, and on many occasions the other languages. So and that was a big incentive to start working at Cal State LA. Cal State LA is a Hispanic serving institution. It's a public institution, and now so I have many students in my undergraduate courses who are first-generation college students. Many of them the children of immigrant families. And so it is very exciting to teach these students and encourage them to advocate for their background. I always try to help them understand that they probably were they learned from a deficit perspective. Many of them come with a view that they are somehow broken because they are bilinguals, even though we are in Los Angeles, a very bilingual city. And it is very exciting when I start to see that spark, that they are changing, that they are becoming more advocates of their own education and of themselves. I'm also happy that we increased the number of our graduate students in terms of diversity over the years. I've been teaching there for 9 years, and when I started, I think in the graduate program, we're a small program, we only have 20 students every year, but there was only one bilingual graduate student, and in this cohort, we have 9 bilingual graduate students. So slowly, I think the community is learning that we are a program that supports bilingualism and that supports bilingual speech-language pathology. And part of our education is understanding the community, understanding parents, learning how to take into account the history. When they work with families, we encourage them to learn about their immigrant histories, trying to expand their view of the world. And I think that basically my role has those two components: learning more about bilingual communication disorders, and also increasing the number of bilingual clinicians in the profession as a whole, and hopefully we'll be able to send them across the nation and change the current situation. And I would like to add one more thing, that Los Angeles is a sanctuary city, and our university has a center for undocumented students that is very strong. They do a wonderful job. But what I have noticed is that in the last year, some of our graduate applicants revealed to us that they were undocumented and that they were really afraid of whether to pursue their education or not. And these were wonderful students, and they were afraid of losing their financial assistance or actually been deported. We had a couple of cases at the university of students who were deported and who were detained, and they were not finally deported. Luckily, I work in an environment that is very supportive, but it took really extra energy to work with these students. And that was in contrast. The election was a night of contrast because we were very excited that Proposition 53 was passed in California, that actually facilitated the creation of dual language programs, and it really came from a very additive position, very positive for multilingual American citizens. This understanding that to be American doesn't mean that you have to be monolingual English. But we had a new president at the same time, so it was a night of contrast. And hopefully, California will fight, and we'll be able to support so many of our students who are either undocumented or actually come from mixed families, and they also have lots of anxiety at the moment. And it's a state as a whole that tends to be more supportive of immigrants.
Thank you. So I can see all of you here. Since I'm the last one, I would like to thank Michelle and my colleagues in this panel for this amazing knowledge sharing and your passion about this work. So I'm going to present things now from the meta health point of view and angle. So let me talk about our lab, the Global Mental Health Lab here at TC. We have a mission which is to contribute to the reduction of the tremendous burden of mental illness, focusing on common mental illness. By that we mean basically depression, anxiety, in low-resource areas around the world. Just to give you very briefly some context, in 2030, depression will be the leading cause of disability of all conditions, including cardiovascular, accidents, etc., number one. So it'll be the highest source of contribution in the global burden of disease, to give you the technical term. The reason is that it starts very early in life, so it's very common. It's also incredibly impairing. It hits people in the most productive years when they're trying to build education and the families. Also, it's very affected by social disadvantage and adversities, which is, of course, something we all have in common. With the populations we work in, refugee and immigrant populations, they suffer from unspeakable adversity. So I'm not going to go into detail about all the tools and methods that we have developed in doing this work. We have methods to engage and collaborate with the local experts, our colleagues there, ministries of health, NGOs, WHO, to understand how people express their suffering, right? The local idioms of distress, what they consider healing, what they select and they think makes sense as an intervention. We adapt a number of interventions. We have a plethora of evidence-based interventions for depression in the West, so we adapt with a lot of local guidance, and we generate knowledge. We test those because we cannot afford to waste people's resources and time for things that are not useful. And if we find that they're useful, then we scale them up. At this point, we have four projects that we have completed that involve refugees. We worked and tested in randomized controlled trial in group interpersonal psychotherapy, which we have actually prepared a version for the World Health Organization, which they disseminated globally online. It's free of charge. So we worked using group IPT. We work in northern Uganda with children in IDP camps, in internally displaced persons camps. There was a terrible civil war there for years. We worked afterwards with depressed, internally displaced women in Bogota, where there are about 6 million, close to 7 million displaced persons. We worked in the Zaatari camp in Jordan with Syrian refugees. And we have, in partnership with the Ministry of Public Health, they called it in Lebanon, we already have a study where we started building capacity and evaluating the program with mental health professionals in Lebanon, where together we adapted again interpersonal psychotherapy. And we trained them and we measured effects on both providers and patients, of course. So right now we have two initiatives, a couple of grants for Lebanon to implement, scale up and study the implementation process and train in implementation science. And another one with the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, UNHCR, to respond to the other big crisis, the other big wound of these years, which is the crisis in Myanmar with the Rohingya refugees. So we'll be working in Bangladesh. In the Cox's Bazar camp, my team is ready to go this summer to a refugee camp of 650,000 people. So what's the role of mental health? The role differs according to the stage, right? So people, the refugees come after, unspeakable experiences, both, especially Syrian and Myanmar refugees, and Rohingya refugees. Before the flight, right, all these things that have been happening. So it's not just a single incident trauma, right, that the models, but continuous persecution and a number of very traumatic events. Things that happen during the flight and also during and post-flight in the adjustment. So when people just settle in, mental health for them is to find food and sanitation, have a house, and reunite with loved ones if it's possible. Our job is to do a number of things at that stage. It's not to go around treating everybody, for PTSD, but focus on those who have very high distress. Also those with pre-existing conditions. We forget that people have, like everybody else in the world, pre-existing conditions, and they leave behind medication and doctors, etc. Usually people, a number of people manage to adjust. They need time. Our colleague George Bornano says, 6 months, sometimes a year, to really adjust to the situation. As social scientists at this level, we can assist the building of community, and it's remarkable to see how people are trying to simulate communities when they are in the camps or in settlements in urban pockets in a number of countries. To assist communication, because communities are healing, and breaking the social isolation is crucial for the healing and increasing social support. We also, in addition to those with high distress and to those who have pre-existing conditions, we really need to help first responders. because they are many times very depressed, and they don't give themselves the right for self-care, and they end up being incredibly burnt out. Actually, with Mary, we have, I'm consulting on her projects to do that with teachers, right? Later on, we have, when we can tell who is going to adjust and who really needs support, we have our methods and our packages that we, again, adapt locally with, now the Rohingyans, there is a team there, and I know that they'll guide us on how to adapt and what to add and what indigenous methods make sense and how to destigmatize depression, right? Use, as we said, local idioms. One thing that I want to underline, note here, is work with children. So the best gift, I think, that you can give to a traumatized child, actually there are two gifts. One is first to take care of the parent, of the caretaker, right, of their own mental health needs. We know that treatment of maternal depression and trauma actually determines, right, whether the kid is going to develop symptoms or not. So this is very crucial. But also take care of the teachers, education. It's something that all refugees agree for as priority for the kids is to get education. And then assist, understand opportunities. So let me share with you for a minute, because we don't want to run out of time, but for 1 second, this model we have in Lebanon, the Ministry of Public Health is using the Syrian crisis as an opportunity to develop systems of care for everybody, not just for the refugees, but also for the population. There are 2 million refugees to 4 million Lebanese. They're incredibly burdened. So we consult with them to assist them in developing systems of care, collaborative care within primary care services, right, and implement psychotherapy and build capacity in the community as well. So there are amazing opportunities in this work, and we need, and I know this will be something that perhaps all of us have, strong ideas about. We need more advocacy in our fields. Thank you.
Thank you. So one of the important aspects of having an interdisciplinary panel focusing on education, psychology, and health is that we really begin to see some of the complex issues that we need to address. And I appreciate Gabriela and Lena for really beginning to opening up some of the ways that we can address some of these complex issues in their work. And I want to ask a couple members of the panel if they would also think about some of the suggestions they have for dealing with this notion of exclusion and inclusion that is taking place around immigrant youth, whether it's around physical border walls or whether it's around mental attitudes of xenophobia and discrimination. Like, how does your work begin to speak to some ways we need to think about pushing back and challenging some of these exclusionary practices?
I'll go ahead and jump in with that. So, in my work, there are numerous, there's really truly a plethora of discriminatory policies, both federal and state policies that exclude the undocumented and the documented. I'm very purposeful in separating those two groups because they really are different in terms of what they can access or what they cannot, mostly those that they cannot access. So federal financial aid, they're excluded from at the federal level, right? So that includes Pell, work study at the state level. The majority of states, they're not eligible, the undocumented population, for in-state resident tuition, state aid. In the vast majority of states, we're talking about 45 here. So it's this constant bombardment that these populations face in relation to these discriminatory public policies that exclude them from, in some instances, even thinking about or aspiring to enroll in post-secondary education, or really trying to go ahead and try to try to get the help that they need. And in facing guidance counselors and school teachers and admissions officers at the post-secondary ed level. A study I did with Dr. Blanca Vega and Mariela Saavedra here in New York City found how the adolescents really faced a bombardment of microaggressions executed by guidance counselors and all these individuals that I mentioned. That made these adolescents feel undeserving, unwelcoming, and really feel that that this is not a place for them, both living as well as trying to access higher education. So why do I mention this? Because it's an important role that we have as educators to be very deliberate and conscious in going ahead and developing policies, lowercase p, I tell my students, in the work that they do in their classrooms, in their departments, in their offices, in their schools, in terms of making the environments much more welcoming for immigrant youth as a whole.
I'll say a couple things that are just kind of related, follow up on that. And kind of thinking, I work a little bit more at the curricular level, and so I've worked with Michelle and Garnet Russell here at TC. We did a workshop on supporting African youth and thinking about how schools and teachers can kind of think about curricular as well as school structural issues that invite youth in. And so to answer your question, I think part of the breaking down of barriers is who we identify where the problem rests. And so I think one issue is often to kind of see the problem in immigrant youth and what is it we change in immigrant youth. And I think the work of curriculum is to shape that and say the problem is actually schools that are they're creating the barriers, and that's what you've also talked about. And so thinking about what is it we do with curriculum, how do we create curriculum related to places in the world, my interest particularly Africa, that actually present Africa in a way that makes Africa a desirable and present place that has its own kind of life and vibrancy, as opposed to the way in which we study it as a European outpost. How is it that we invite teachers to kind of invite their students in, know more about and learn about their students so they can kind of talk about the things that their students bring to class and associate with them. So very much kind of think about those curricular issues. And then just in terms of civics, in terms of opening up our civics curriculum, to think about not just to focus on what are the kind of legal rights and responsibilities, but to recognize that many youth in our classrooms are not and may never be kind of legal citizens, or if they are, they might want to access that in a global way rather than a nationally oriented way. So how do we kind of revise our thinking around kind of civics curriculum in and of itself to be around, truly around kind of civics and identities and community rather than around kind of citizenships and political structures?
I think this is a huge task and something that requires response at multiple levels, policy levels, practice levels. But just from the research that I've done with teachers, whether they're Kenyan teachers hosting refugee students in their classrooms in Nairobi, or U.S. teachers right here in Brooklyn hosting immigrant and newly arrived or recently resettled refugees, when you ask them what they need or what they think they need to better tend to the needs of these students, they all, I think every interview I've ever done, they've said they never had any training about what they're dealing with right now. They never had any training or opportunity to reflect on where these kids have come from, what their educational or life trajectories have been before they walked into that room. They haven't really thought carefully about the psychosocial needs of these learners and how they might respond or how they might not respond because they're not the best ones to respond. They're not well trained enough. And also shouldn't have to take on the burden of doing all of that work. So what are these other resources within the community, within the school, within the society to help do that? And so I do think there's something, as educators, as people who are connected to Teachers College and beyond, really have to think about the teacher professional development that we are engaging in and where are the opportunities to help better inform teachers who are doing this. And I think connected to the xenophobic piece and the discriminatory pieces that we're seeing by educators, right, is when can they have a moment to reflect on their own approaches, their biases, their prejudices coming into this, and having a chance to push back on their own beliefs, perhaps, and how much influence and how much power they have in classrooms, in training rooms, to perpetuate some of the negativity that we're seeing, right? So there's a lot that has to be done, but a lot of potential, a lot of opportunity to do it at the same time.
Okay, before I ask this last question, I know many of you obviously came because you have an interest in immigrant and refugee populations. So I just want you to take 30 seconds and think about what words come to mind when you do hear the word immigrant and refugee. Okay, so I want you to hold on to those images that have come to mind, and the question I'm going to ask for the panel to think about is, what would you like the audience to know about the groups or populations you work with that they might not know already, and or that might be distorted through media portrayals of these individuals? Okay, go for it.
I would like you to all realize that most, if not all, immigrant families really want to have their children be successful, be fluent English speakers. They really do not want them to, they want to be part of the community. And so this fear for bilingualism, this push for English only is really unnecessary, because families really want their children to be part of society, and they understand that English is very important. And yeah, so I would say that that's the main point I would like you to remember.
The point that I'd like you to remember is what I tell my students: patients are us. Right? Mental health issues are not just, severe mental illness that affects 1% of the population. Everybody here has a family member or a good friend who had struggled at some point in their lives with a mental health issue. So it's very important to make sure, as you said, Mary, and my other colleagues, to also be aware, how we perpetuate the stigma through jokes, through things that we catch ourselves. Nobody's perfect. We always need to think how we contribute to this. And also how to, be advocates and develop advocates for that. About advocacy, I have to learn things, on the job. About advocacy, I was not trained in my graduate program, and we still don't train our students, right, to do advocacy. That's a very important part. But we also need to be led by the ideas that our students have. I mean, they bring amazing, innovative ideas and passion, and we need to learn about how to, ideas of new waves and new approaches to advocacy with a number of new platforms. And also we need to learn from our patients. It has happened now to a number of clinical trials and studies that we have run, that after people feel better, they come to us and say, how can I help others here in the community? So these are amazing advocates, right? And actually some of them in Africa have developed CBOs and do national work. They scaled up their advocacy and they work with the Ministry of Health.
I know, I just am trying to, but maybe ours overlap. We can like connect maybe together a little bit. So I would just say that, I just quickly add that, I mean, the youth that I work with, I have built websites that all speak back to this. I could just show you the websites and do all of the ways in which the stereotypes that we live with are just not what Africa actually looks like. And so so not only is this a continent with thousands of years of history and whole ways that people have resisted colonization and kind of are innovative and do interesting things that are just never or almost never portrayed in the community and on television and media by our governments and various things. So I think there's so much from that we could say. But I think it's just very interesting if you want to see it, just go down to Little Senegal, go to 116th Street, meander into all of the wonderful African shops, meander along 125th Street, stop and talk to the vendors, go into the Maisel Center, the Cinema Center of the Congo on Lenox Avenue, 125th and Lenox, Malcolm X. So, there's so much. It's interesting. I think the thing that, rather than just kind of disrupting the kind of Africa you see in the media, is that just open your eyes in New York City and you see kind of beautiful narratives of the continent right here in the city.
So now we would like to open it up to your questions, thoughts, comments that you would like to share with all of us. Yes.
How do you, if at all, sort of address sort of the specific needs of maybe not just sort of people with stateless and never been documented? They're not really specific.
Well, one population that comes to mind, although it would be useful to hear what you have in mind with that type of population, but the Rohingya refugees, for example. This is, there was somebody, one of our students who does a different type of work, not mental health, but work with arts. And he came back, he went to Bangladesh, to Cox's Bazar, to work with Rohingya refugees, and he said, what I see there happening, he has worked in other areas around the world with Syrians, etc., etc. He was saying that it's the descriptions that you hear about Holocaust, this is what happens, with these refugees. So they have been tremendously, wounded all over years, very little literacy, a lot of violence, right? And trauma also makes people feel, that there is danger everywhere, so they become, more violent or fight or flight, right? If the body is prepared for that. So men beat up women, both of them beat up the kids, families who have 7, 8, 9 children. So what was surprising to me, though, and I learned that from the local colleagues who worked in Cox's Bazar, in that refugee center, is that mainly women come to the clinic and they're much more open to receiving help, especially if they're in groups, than people thought initially. They thought, well, this is stigma, don't even try, etc., etc. Well, actually, that's not the case. And when other women see women who are struggling, doing better, then they want to come. Right? And hopefully, we don't know that about this population, but our experience in northern Uganda, in a current trial that I have now with women, is husbands. And in northern Uganda, many of the husbands were children, former children soldiers. After they saw their wives and relatives getting better, they wanted now treatment there. So when community witnesses people improving and they see the results, of the work, then of course they want to use it more.
Yeah, I don't have an answer for you. I'm not working directly with stateless persons, but just a couple weeks ago, this is totally anecdotal, and I probably shouldn't even be doing this, but I had a taxi driver who was from Burma, and we started talking about the political situation. And, I told him a little bit about my work and how I was, just horrified by what I understand to be happening in the region. It's not an area of the world that I've been working in. And it was fascinating to me to hear his response about how this was a made-up group and how they never belonged to Myanmar, and his kind of deeply rooted historical perspective about that. And I remember walking away from the conversation going, wow, where do you go from here if that's such deeply entrenched positionality about that particular group of people? So that's why I'm saying I don't have an answer for you. Just it is such a challenge, right? But then thinking about, again, all the work that we're doing, we come at it at different levels, right? Downstream, upstream, policy practice, and I do think some of these, deeper quagmires do require that kind of multi-pronged approach, right? There needs to be the international pressure to alleviate the human rights abuses that are happening against that particular population. There have to be community-based organizations and social movements that help to kind of demystify the other in these contexts through education, through community mobilization campaigns. I don't know what the answer is, but it does feel like this is one of the more pernicious issues, and we really have to come at it from multiple levels. And it's incumbent on all of us to better educate ourselves about how we can have informed conversations about that and how we can support different movements in that direction. I did. I know what we should be doing, we aren't doing it. Yeah. That's attempted.
Let me jump in here because, when we talk about the documented population, in many ways, they feel a state, right, here in the U.S., but in many ways they're treated as stateless. So in this Michigan project, where we've been sort of taking a look at Cecilia Menjivar's work around legal liminality, and really sort of trying to problematize DACA of what we call sort of these missed opportunities that DACA has afforded this population. Population, right, that largely feels this as being their home and their only home that they know, but in many ways being treated that this is not their home.
Well, I don't know if we don't know if they will suffer more, but I do hear from our graduate students who are doing their externships in the public schools that even the children in special education talk about the wall. They are afraid of their parents. They were crying the day after the election, things like that. So that's another component that will impact. And I think the clinicians in the schools, the teachers, the speech-language pathologists in the schools, not all of them have the training to support these children. But on many occasions, they do not know how to react. So I agree with all of you. We really need to train our educators and our clinicians about this specifically, because the children are talking about these issues. Another thing that happens, the parents are more scared. So, an accent it has a similar effect as your skin color, right? We open our mouth and people know that you have an accent, you were not born here, and there are microaggressions, and many parents do not want their children to maintain their home language because they are afraid of that. They do not want their children to go through that. And that's a shame also, because after years, I tell parents, when I start to work with a parent who has a young child, a preschoolers, I tell them, think about the future. You will need to talk with your son or daughter about sex, about money, about love, about religion, and you will speak about all of those issues from your heart in a better way using your language. So you want your child to understand you in the future. So we'll see. But I'm hopeful. I think that even though not everyone is ready, we are becoming more aware. And I hope that we will, if we are involved in education, we will help other professionals on that. Yeah.